Have you ever loved someone so deeply that even after they were gone, a part of your heart kept waiting for them? Not waiting in an obvious way, but quietly, in the small moments when life slows down, maybe late at night when everything becomes silent, or early in the morning when the world hasn't fully woken up yet. There is a strange kind of emptiness that follows a love that once felt real, not dramatic, not loud. Just a quiet awareness that something meaningful passed through your life and then disappeared. People often say that time heals everything, and in some ways it does. The pain softens. The memories stop hurting the way they once did, but sometimes another feeling replaces the pain. A quiet question. What if that was the deepest love I will ever experience? Many people carry this thought without even realizing it. They begin to believe that the most powerful connection of their life already happened, and that everything that comes after will simply be smaller, less intense, less meaningful. So they slowly adjust their expectations. They become more careful with their heart, more guarded, more realistic. They tell themselves that love is unpredictable, that it rarely comes twice in the same powerful way. But somewhere deeper inside you, there may still be a small voice that disagrees with that idea, a quiet intuition that whispers something different. It suggests that life may not move the way we think it does, that love may not appear only once in its deepest form, and that sometimes the heart is not meant to experience its greatest connection first. Sometimes it happens later, after life has changed you, after you have learned things about yourself that you didn't understand before. Because when love arrives at that moment, it feels different. Not rushed, not uncertain, but strangely familiar, as if two lives that were moving in completely different directions were slowly being guided toward the same place. And the strange thing is, the person who eventually enters your life in that moment may understand your heart in a way no one ever has before. Not because they know your past, but because they recognize something in you that others never noticed. And when that kind of connection begins to unfold, it can make you realize something surprising. The love you thought was the deepest you could ever feel may have only been preparing your heart for something even greater. Before we go any further, there is something important you need to understand. If you've experienced heartbreak, disappointment, or relationships that didn't unfold the way you hoped, that does not mean you failed at love, and it certainly does not mean that something is wrong with you. In fact, the opposite is often true. People who feel the deepest pain after a relationship ends are usually the same people who are capable of loving the most deeply. They are the ones who open their hearts fully, the ones who believe in connection, the ones who allow another person to see them without masks. And when that kind of openness meets the wrong circumstances, the emotional impact can feel overwhelming. But that pain is not proof that your heart is weak. It is proof that your heart is alive. The world often teaches us a strange lesson about love. It tells us that the safest way to avoid emotional pain is to become more careful, more guarded, more controlled. So after experiencing heartbreak, many people slowly begin to build emotional walls. Not intentionally, but naturally. They start analyzing every interaction. They question whether someone is truly interested. They try to protect themselves from becoming too attached again. And while this may seem like a form of wisdom, it often creates the opposite effect. Because love was never meant to grow in an atmosphere of fear. It grows in openness, in trust, in emotional presence. But here is where something deeper begins to happen. After a painful experience, the subconscious mind quietly records what happened. It forms conclusions about love, relationships, and vulnerability. And most of these conclusions are formed without you consciously realizing it. Joseph Murphy explained this beautifully when he spoke about the influence of the subconscious mind. According to his teachings, the subconscious mind is constantly absorbing the emotional impressions we carry, not just our thoughts, but our feelings, our expectations, our beliefs about what is possible for us. And once a belief settles into the subconscious mind, it begins influencing how we experience life. If someone experiences deep emotional loss, the subconscious mind may form a protective belief. It might quietly conclude, love leads to pain, or deep connection never lasts, or even, the person meant for me already came and went. These beliefs are rarely spoken out loud. Most people never consciously say them, but they exist quietly beneath the surface. And because the subconscious mind shapes how we interpret the world, these beliefs begin influencing what we notice. They affect how we respond to people, how open we are to connection, how safe we feel when someone begins getting close to us. Sometimes this happens in subtle ways. You may meet someone kind, attentive, emotionally present. But instead of relaxing into the experience, a small voice inside you becomes cautious. It wonders if the connection is too good to be true. It searches for signs that something might go wrong. Not because you want to sabotage love, but because the mind is trying to protect you from repeating the same emotional pain. This protective instinct is deeply human. Your mind is simply trying to keep you safe. But the subconscious mind does not always distinguish between protecting you and limiting you. When a belief forms that deep love only happens once the mind begins to treat that idea as reality, it stops expecting extraordinary connection. It stops imagining that someone could enter your life and understand you in a deeper way. And because expectations influence perception, those possibilities become harder to recognize. But none of this means that love has disappeared from your path. It simply means that the mind has been carrying a story that may not be true. Joseph Murphy often reminded people that beliefs are not permanent structures, they are patterns, and patterns can change. The subconscious mind is not fixed, it is responsive. It adapts to the emotional impressions we repeatedly give it. Which means something powerful becomes possible the moment you begin questioning the assumptions you have carried about love. The moment you stop assuming that your greatest love already happened, your mind begins opening to new possibilities. And when the mind opens, life often begins presenting experiences that match that openness. But before we talk about how that shift happens, there is something else you need to understand. Because the reason many people struggle to experience deeper love again has very little to do with timing, and everything to do with a misunderstanding about how love actually enters our lives. And once you see that clearly, the entire story begins to change. When people experience a painful ending in love, something subtle begins to change in the way they approach relationships. Not always immediately. Sometimes it happens slowly over months or even years. But eventually, many people begin moving through love with a quiet sense of caution. They start protecting their heart in ways they never did before. And while this may seem like a wise response, it often creates a pattern that most people never notice. Because after heartbreak, people usually fall into one of two behaviors. The first group begins chasing love more intensely. They feel the emotional void left behind, and they try to fill it as quickly as possible. They search for someone who can recreate the same feeling they once experienced. They compare new connections to the old one. They measure every interaction against a memory. And without realizing it, they begin placing enormous pressure on every relationship that follows. But love rarely grows well under pressure. When we try to recreate a past emotional experience, we are not truly seeing the person in front of us. We are searching for an echo of someone who once existed in our life. And when that echo does not appear, disappointment quietly follows. The second group moves in the opposite direction. Instead of chasing love, they begin lowering their emotional expectations. They convince themselves that deep connection is rare, that perhaps they already experienced their greatest love. So they become more careful, more reserved. They tell themselves they are simply being realistic. But what they are actually doing is something much deeper. They are adjusting their emotional blueprint. Joseph Murphy spoke often about the role of the subconscious mind in shaping the experiences we encounter. He explained that life does not simply respond to what we consciously want. It responds to what we quietly expect. And expectations are powerful. Because expectations influence behavior, they influence perception. They influence the subtle emotional signals we send to others without even realizing it. If someone believes that deep love rarely happens twice, that belief changes how they move through relationships. They may hesitate when someone begins getting close. They may hold back emotionally. They may unconsciously assume that the connection will eventually fade. And these small internal expectations can slowly shape the outcome of the relationship itself. This is not because life is punishing anyone. It is because our inner beliefs influence how we experience the world. Joseph Murphy described the subconscious mind as something incredibly responsive. It absorbs repeated emotional impressions and begins treating them as instructions. If the mind repeatedly hears the message that love leads to disappointment, it begins organizing experiences around that assumption. Not intentionally, but naturally, and this is why many people find themselves repeating similar relationship patterns. Different people, different circumstances, but the emotional outcome feels strangely familiar. They may encounter partners who are emotionally unavailable, or connections that start beautifully but eventually fade. And after experiencing this more than once, many people begin asking the same painful question: why does this keep happening to me? But the answer is rarely found by analyzing the past relationships themselves. The deeper cause often exists within the beliefs that quietly formed afterward. Because once the mind accepts a story about how love works, it begins filtering reality through that story. Imagine walking through life while holding the belief that the deepest love you will ever experience already happened. That belief would change how you see new people. You might overlook someone whose affection is sincere. You might underestimate a connection that could have grown into something extraordinary. Because the mind has already decided what is possible. And when the mind decides something is unlikely, it stops recognizing the signs when it appears. But here is where something important begins to shift, because Joseph Murphy also emphasized that beliefs are not permanent truths. They are learned assumptions, and any assumption that was learned can be replaced. The moment a person begins questioning the story they have carried about love, something powerful begins to happen. The subconscious mind becomes open to a different emotional possibility, and when that openness appears, life often begins presenting experiences that match that new belief. But this leads to an even deeper understanding, because the way love enters our lives is not random. It follows certain principles that most people are never taught to recognize. And once you understand one particular principle about how emotional connection unfolds, you begin to realize that the future of your love life may look very different from what you once believed. To understand why love can appear in unexpected ways later in life, we first need to understand a principle that Joseph Murphy spoke about often. It is something simple but incredibly powerful. He called it the law of belief. According to Murphy, the subconscious mind does not judge, argue, or question the ideas we impress upon it. Instead, it accepts them. And once a belief is accepted deeply enough, the subconscious mind begins organizing our experiences around that belief, not through force, not through luck, but through alignment. Our thoughts influence our emotional state. Our emotional state influences our behavior, and our behavior influences the types of people and situations we encounter. Most people assume life unfolds randomly, but Murphy suggested that life is constantly responding to the inner assumptions we carry. If someone believes that opportunities are scarce, they begin seeing limitations everywhere. If someone believes that meaningful connection is rare, they begin interpreting relationships through that expectation. And over time, those expectations begin shaping their reality. This does not mean that life becomes completely controlled by thought, but it does mean that the mind plays a much larger role in shaping our experiences than most people realize. Now consider what happens after someone experiences heartbreak. At first, the pain is emotional, but eventually, the pain transforms into a belief, a quiet assumption about how love works. Someone may begin telling themselves things like, "Deep love only happens once. People eventually leave. Real connection is rare." And even if these thoughts are never spoken out loud, the subconscious mind absorbs them. Over time, these ideas become emotional expectations, and expectations are powerful Because the subconscious mind filters reality based on what it expects to find. Joseph Murphy often compared the subconscious mind to fertile soil. If you plant seeds of doubt, the soil will grow experiences that reflect doubt. If you plant seeds of possibility, the soil begins producing opportunities that reflect possibility. The soil itself does not judge the seed. It simply grows what it is given. In the same way, the subconscious mind does not evaluate whether a belief is beneficial or limiting. It simply accepts what is repeatedly impressed upon it. This is why two people can experience the same situation in completely different ways. One person may see disappointment everywhere. Another may notice meaningful connections forming around them. Both individuals are moving through the same world, but their subconscious beliefs shape what they notice and what they overlook. Now here is where something interesting begins to happen. When a person begins believing that their greatest love already happened in the past, the subconscious mind begins organizing life around that idea. The mind stops looking forward with expectation. It begins looking backward with comparison. And comparison quietly closes the door to possibility, because every new connection is measured against a memory. And memories are powerful. They are emotionally vivid, but they are also incomplete. What many people fail to realize is that love is not something static. It evolves. It deepens as we grow. The person you were 5 or 10 years ago is not the same person you are today. Your understanding of relationships has changed. Your emotional awareness has expanded. Your capacity for empathy and connection has matured. And this means something important. The kind of love you are capable of experiencing now may be deeper than anything you were capable of experiencing before. But if the mind continues believing that the best love already happened, it becomes difficult to recognize when something deeper begins to appear. Joseph Murphy believed that changing life experiences begins with changing inner belief, not forcing circumstances, not chasing outcomes, but quietly reshaping the assumptions held within the subconscious mind. Because the moment the mind begins expecting something meaningful to appear in the future, the entire emotional posture of a person begins to change. They become more open, more present, more willing to see people for who they truly are. And when that openness appears, something unexpected often happens. Connections begin forming that would have gone unnoticed before. People who once seemed ordinary begin revealing unexpected depth. And sometimes, the person who eventually enters your life carries an emotional energy that feels different from anything you experienced in the past. Not because they are perfect, but because they meet you at a moment in life where both of you understand love differently. And that is when something truly surprising can unfold. Because the connection that appears later in life may not simply repeat the love you once experienced. It may reveal a form of love that is deeper than anything you have known before. Now, this is where something important begins to reveal itself. Because once you understand how belief shapes experience, another realization quietly follows. Sometimes the love that enters your life later is not simply another relationship. It is a different kind of connection entirely. Many people assume that the most powerful love they will ever feel must happen early in life, when emotions are intense, when everything feels new, when the heart experiences connection without hesitation. But what Joseph Murphy's teachings gently suggest is that life does not move according to emotional timelines. It moves according to inner readiness, and inner readiness often develops slowly, through experience, through healing, through the lessons that heartbreak quietly leaves behind. Each relationship you experience teaches your heart something. You begin to understand what respect feels like, what emotional safety feels like, what genuine connection feels like, and perhaps most importantly, you begin to recognize what love is not. In your younger years, love can sometimes be guided by excitement alone, chemistry, intensity, the thrill of discovering someone new. But deeper love, the kind that changes your life, often appears when the heart has matured enough to recognize it. And when that moment arrives, something unexpected sometimes happens. The person who enters your life carries a different kind of emotional presence. Sometimes their spirit feels lighter, more open. less guarded. They approach connection with curiosity instead of fear. They are not weighed down by the same emotional disappointments. And because of that, they bring a kind of energy into the relationship that feels refreshingly genuine. In many cases, this person may even feel younger in spirit. Not necessarily younger in years, although sometimes they are, but younger in emotional outlook. They believe in love without overanalyzing it. They express affection without hesitation. They see your depth without being intimidated by it. And when someone like this enters your life, something interesting begins to happen. Your past no longer feels like a collection of painful endings. It begins to feel like preparation, because the experiences that once seemed like losses quietly shaped the person you became. They taught you patience. They taught you emotional awareness. They taught you how to recognize sincerity when it appears. And when you meet someone whose heart is open in a way that surprises you, you realize something that many people never expect. The love you once believed was the deepest you could ever feel was only the beginning of what your heart was capable of experiencing. This kind of connection feels different. It is calmer, more stable, more emotionally present. There is less confusion, less guessing, less emotional distance. Instead, there is understanding. A sense that both people see each other clearly. Joseph Murphy often explained that when the subconscious mind begins accepting new beliefs about what is possible, life responds by presenting new experiences that reflect those beliefs. And this is why something remarkable sometimes happens after a person releases the belief that their greatest love is already behind them. They begin encountering people who match the emotional openness they have rediscovered. They meet individuals who appreciate their depth rather than fear it. People who see their past not as damage but as wisdom. And sometimes the person who arrives carries an energy that feels surprisingly fresh. They look at you without the expectations others once had. They do not measure you against who you used to be. They simply recognize who you are now. And because their spirit approaches love with openness, they often love in a way that feels deeper than anything you have experienced before. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more genuine, more patient, more understanding. And this is the moment when something profound becomes clear. Love does not always reach its highest expression in the first chapter of your life. Sometimes it appears later, when you have grown into the person you were meant to become. And when someone enters your life at that moment, someone whose heart recognizes yours without hesitation, the connection can feel deeper than anything you believed possible before. Not because your past love was meaningless, but because your heart has evolved. And the love that meets an evolved heart often becomes the deepest love of all. Ideas are powerful, but people rarely believe something fully until they see how it appears in real life. And if you listen carefully to the stories people share about love later in life, you begin to notice a pattern. Again and again, people describe meeting someone unexpected, someone whose presence feels different from anything they experienced before. Not because the connection is dramatic, but because it feels honest, calm, real. Let me share a few examples that reveal how this kind of connection often unfolds. The first story comes from a woman who once believed her greatest love had already happened. In her early 30s, she experienced a relationship that felt incredibly intense. They were deeply connected. They spoke about the future. They imagined building a life together. But after several years, the relationship ended in a way she never expected. For a long time, she carried the quiet belief that nothing would ever feel that powerful again. She dated occasionally, but every new connection seemed smaller than what she once experienced. Eventually, she stopped searching, not because she had given up on love completely, but because she believed the most meaningful chapter had already happened. Nearly 10 years later, something surprising occurred. She met someone through a mutual friend. At first, nothing seemed extraordinary. The conversation was simple, comfortable. But over time, she noticed something she had never experienced before. This person listened differently. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't trying to control the direction of the relationship. Instead, he was simply present, curious about who she was, interested in her thoughts, her experiences, and even the parts of her past that once felt painful to talk about. One evening she said something that stayed with him. She told him, "I always thought I already experienced the deepest love of my life." And he responded with a quiet smile. Maybe that love was just teaching you how to recognize the next one. Years later, she described that relationship in a way that surprised even her. She said the love she experienced later in life was not more intense, but it was deeper, more stable, more emotionally safe. It felt like loving with wisdom. The second story comes from a man who spent most of his life believing relationships had to be complicated. In his past experiences, love always felt heavy. There were constant misunderstandings, emotional distance, moments where he felt like he had to prove his worth. He assumed this was simply how relationships worked, until one day he met someone whose emotional energy felt completely different. She was open, direct, unafraid to express affection. What surprised him most was how easy the connection felt. There were no games, no confusion. And at first, this simplicity actually made him uncomfortable. He had grown so accustomed to emotional struggle that calm connection felt unfamiliar. But as time passed, something began to change. He realized that love did not need to feel exhausting to be meaningful. Sometimes the deepest connection appears not through intensity, but through emotional clarity. The third story is perhaps the most common. Two people meet when neither of them is actively searching for love. Both have experienced enough of life to understand themselves better. Both have learned from past relationships. And when they meet, something unusual happens. Instead of trying to become someone else for the relationship, they simply show up as they are. There is honesty from the beginning. They speak openly about their past experiences, not as wounds that need fixing, but as lessons that shaped who they are. And in that honesty, trust forms quickly, not because the relationship moves fast, but because both people recognize something familiar in each other, a level of emotional awareness that did not exist in their earlier years. This is something many people eventually discover. The love that arrives later in life often carries a different kind of depth. It is not driven only by excitement, it is guided by understanding. Two people who have learned about themselves meet at a moment when they are capable of loving more consciously. And when that happens, the connection can feel incredibly meaningful, not because it erases the past, but because it builds upon everything the past taught you. These stories are not rare. In fact, they happen quietly all the time. But many people overlook them because they are still holding the belief that their most meaningful love already happened. Yet again and again, life reveals something surprising. The heart does not stop growing after one chapter. Sometimes the experiences that once felt like endings were actually guiding you toward a connection that understands you in a way no one ever has before. Understanding these ideas can feel comforting, but the real question is simple. How do you actually apply this in your life? How do you move from carrying the belief that your greatest love is behind you to opening yourself to the possibility that something deeper may still be unfolding? Joseph Murphy believed that the most important shift begins within the subconscious mind, not through force, not through trying to convince yourself aggressively, but through gentle, repeated impressions that reshape what the mind quietly expects from life. And the first step is surprisingly simple. You begin by releasing the assumption that your past love was the peak of your emotional life. Many people carry this belief without even realizing it. They compare every new connection to a memory. They measure people against someone from their past. And without intending to, they close the door on new possibilities. So the first practice is awareness. When you notice yourself thinking that the best love of your life already happened, pause for a moment. Do not criticize the thought. Simply question it. Ask yourself, is it possible that life still has experiences for me that I cannot yet imagine? This question alone begins to soften the old belief, because the subconscious mind responds strongly to possibility. Joseph Murphy often suggested using simple statements that gently guide the mind toward new expectations. Not dramatic affirmations, not exaggerated promises, but calm statements that feel believable. For example, you might quietly remind yourself, "The love meant for me is still unfolding," or "My heart is open to connections that are deeper than anything I have experienced before." These statements are not about forcing reality to change. They are about allowing the subconscious mind to release old assumptions. When the mind stops expecting disappointment, something subtle changes in the way you move through life. You become more present. You listen differently when you meet someone new. You allow conversations to unfold naturally instead of analyzing every detail. Another important practice is releasing comparison. The mind loves to compare present experiences with past memories, but comparison rarely allows something new to grow. Every relationship is different. Every connection carries its own rhythm, its own emotional language. If you constantly measure a new person against someone from your past, you will never fully see who they are. Instead, try approaching new connections with curiosity, not expectation, not pressure, simply curiosity. Ask yourself, who is this person really? What do they see in life? How do they experience love? When you approach people this way, you give the connection room to develop naturally. Joseph Murphy also spoke about the importance of emotional alignment. If someone wants to experience a relationship filled with kindness, understanding, and emotional safety, they must begin cultivating those same qualities within themselves. This means practicing patience, practicing honesty, practicing emotional presence. Because the energy we bring into relationships often shapes the type of connection we attract. When you become someone who values emotional clarity and authenticity, you naturally resonate with people who carry similar qualities. And this is where something powerful begins to happen. Instead of searching desperately for love, you begin creating the conditions in which love can recognize you. You move through life with openness rather than urgency. You stop forcing outcomes, and you allow connection to develop at its own pace. Many people are surprised by what happens when they reach this state. They begin meeting people who feel emotionally familiar. Conversations flow naturally. Trust forms more easily. And instead of wondering whether love will appear, they begin recognizing when it quietly enters their life. The truth is that meaningful love rarely arrives when someone is chasing it desperately. It often appears when a person has reached a place of emotional balance, a place where they are no longer defined by their past experiences, but instead guided by the possibility of what life may still reveal. And when you begin living from that place, you may discover something unexpected. The connection that eventually enters your life may not resemble anything you imagined before. It may be calmer, more grounded, more emotionally aware. But in that calmness, you may feel something deeper than you ever expected. A love that does not compete with the past, but quietly surpasses it. When you begin to understand these ideas, something inside you starts to change. You stop seeing your past relationships as failures. You stop thinking of heartbreak as evidence that something went wrong in your life. Instead, you begin to see those experiences differently. As preparation, every meaningful connection you experienced taught your heart something important, even the painful ones. They showed you what emotional honesty looks like. They revealed what respect feels like and what it doesn't. They helped you recognize the difference between intensity and genuine care. And most importantly, they helped you understand yourself. Because every relationship acts like a mirror. It reflects parts of your personality, your fears, your strengths, and your desires. When you step back and look at your past from this perspective, you begin to realize something powerful. Your heart has not been damaged by love. It has been refined by it. It has grown wiser, more aware, more capable of recognizing what truly matters. And that growth changes the kind of love you are capable of experiencing. The person you were years ago loved in one way, but the person you are today loves differently, with more understanding, more patience, more depth. This means the connection that eventually enters your life in the future will not meet the person you used to be. It will meet the person you have become, someone who understands the value of emotional presence, someone who no longer confuses attention with genuine connection, someone who recognizes when love is sincere, Joseph Murphy believed that when the subconscious mind begins accepting a new belief about what is possible, life responds by gradually aligning circumstances with that belief, not overnight, but steadily, quietly. And the belief that changes everything is this: your greatest love may still be ahead of you, not because the past was meaningless, but because the heart continues evolving. Life does not stop offering meaningful experiences simply because one chapter ended. Sometimes the most meaningful chapters appear later, when two people meet after they have both learned something about themselves, after they have both experienced enough of life to understand what truly matters. When that kind of meeting happens, the connection often carries a sense of calm recognition. There is less confusion, less emotional struggle. Both people understand the importance of honesty. They communicate more clearly. They appreciate the presence of someone who sees them as they truly are. And this is when love begins to feel different, not rushed, not uncertain, but grounded. Two people walking beside each other, not because they need to fill an emptiness, but because they genuinely value the connection they share. This kind of love does not try to compete with the past. It does not erase the memories of the relationships that came before. Instead, it builds upon everything those experiences taught you. It becomes deeper because you are deeper. It becomes more meaningful because you recognize its value. And the moment you begin living with this understanding, something important shifts inside you. You stop waiting for life to repeat the past. You start allowing life to surprise you. You become open to the possibility that someone may enter your life whose presence feels refreshingly genuine. Someone who approaches love with curiosity instead of fear. Someone whose spirit may even feel younger in the way they see the world. And when that person appears, you will not recognize them because they resemble someone from your past. You will recognize them because of how they make you feel seen, understood, accepted without hesitation. That is the kind of connection that reveals how much your heart has grown. And once you understand this, you begin moving through life differently. You stop guarding your heart as if love is something rare that must be protected at all costs. Instead, you carry quiet confidence, the confidence that life still has meaningful connections waiting to unfold. You are not someone whose story of love has already been written. You are someone whose heart is still evolving, and sometimes the love that arrives when you least expect it is the love that understands you more deeply than anyone ever has before. Because the moment you stop believing your greatest love is behind you, you create space for the love that was quietly moving toward you all along.